Hello everyone, in today's After Effects scripting tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to make a script that will allow you to save and load data from an item, layer, and effect. So the basic way this is going to work is we can choose which property we want to save or load. If we were to say save the item, we can click on save, and it's going to save some comp data into a text file called item, and you can see it's going to give us the name, the width, the height, the frame rate, as well as the duration. And we basically are going to be creating a text file for the effects, layers, and item. And then what we can do, say I want to change this layer here, it's currently called T Neon Intro. If I go to my script and select layer, and we want to load this layer.txt, which has the name DJ Roller December Early Edit.mp4 and these other information, we'll click on load. And as you can see, it's changed the name of our layer as well as applied the position and scale and other properties that were included when we previously saved this file. And then of course finally we can change the effect up here, which is just going to change the name. So if I click on load, it's going to change it to brightness and contrast. Alright, so that's the basic idea of what we're going to be learning today. We'll basically be learning how to read and write text files, which although we've gone over before, we're going to be using it for specific purposes, and in this case that's changing a composition, changing a layer, as well as effects. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got about 140-ish lines of code to write. We'll start by opening a new JavaScript file, and I'll go ahead and clean up my workspace a bit here and zoom in. Now, realize that this script could be used to create some kind of preset library. Say you add a bunch of effects to some footage and it looks really good, so you want to save it. You could use this method to save presets and then reload them back into a comp. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, like we're not supposed to do in JavaScript, set up our global variables. And in this case, we're just going to have one called location. And that's just going to reference the location where I want my text files to be. So in my C drive, I have a folder called data, and that's just going to be the folder we use. That's really all we need for the global variables here. The only thing we need to keep track of is the location. Everything else is going to be pretty self-working. So let's go ahead and create our UI real quick. As you can see, it's going to be really simple. We're going to have one group for our drop down here, and then another group for our buttons. So we'll start off by saying main window is equal to a new window, and it's going to be a palette. And we're just going to call this save and load data, a very generic name. And then we'll set the orientation of our main window to be column. Then for our first group, we'll just call it group 1. Set that equal to our main window, and we're going to add a group, undefined size, and we'll just call it group 1. We don't really need to set up the orientation, but it is, as usual, good practice to do so. So I'll grab my group 1 and set the orientation to row from left to right. And then we just need to create our dropdown. Let's just call it the type dropdown. So we'll say var type dropdown is equal to our group 1 here. And we're going to be adding a drop down list with undefined size. And then for the third parameter, we need to pass through all of the values that we're going to be using. So that's going to be item, layer, and effect. So we're going to need to create brackets here to let it know we're passing through multiple values. And for the first one, we'll just pass a string called item, second one layer, and third one effect. And then we'll also want to grab our type dropdown and set the selection, which is basically what it's going to be default selected to. If you just run it without the selection set up, then it's just going to have a blank space selected. So I'm going to set the selection to 0, which is going to select item right off the bat. Alright, now for our buttons group, create group 2 here, set it equal to our main window, and add a group, undefined size, and we'll call it group 2. And this time we're especially going to need to set up the orientation, and I'll set that to row. Alright, now for our two buttons, we'll just call one the load button and one the save button, just to be straightforward here. For our load button, we'll set that equal to group 2, add a button, undefined size, and call it load. And then what I can do is just copy this and paste it here and change the name from load to save. Alright, that's actually going to do it for our UI here. So I'm going to center our main window, and I'm going to grab our main window again and show it. So if I were to run this, you can see it looks just like the previous one. We've got our drop-down list here with 3 selections and our load and save buttons. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is set up a sort of initialization check function, and this is just going to be when we click on the load button. So what I'm going to do below all of this here is say load button, and I'm going to say on click. So if we click on the load button, we want to do a function and then our brackets. And inside of here, we're going to create a variable called our load data. And this is going to be either equal to our item text file, our layer text file, or our effect text file. So I'm just going to make a quick key here. If it's going to be 0, it's going to be item. 1 is equal to our layer, and 2 is equal to the effect. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to add a switch statement which will check the selection of our dropdown. So we want to check our type dropdown dot selection and the index of that selection. So if they have selected item, the index is going to be 0. If they've selected layer, 1, and effect 2. So we're going to create a case for each of these. Case 0, break, case 1, break, and case 2, break. And the first thing we're going to do inside of each of these cases is set our load data variable equal to a function called load file, and we're just going to paste that in the 3 cases here. And we're going to be setting up this function here in a second, but the string we're going to want to pass through is the name of the text file associated with which dropdown index is selected. So if, let's say, they have the item selected, we're going to want to pass through a string as our argument, and that's going to be item.txt, and we're adding this slash here because it's going to be added onto the end of this location string here. So in this one, we'll say item.text, in this one we'll say layer.text, and this one effect.text. Then down below, I'm just going to set up our load file function. So I'll say function load file, and then for the argument, we'll just call this the file string. And then inside of our load file function, we're just going to be reading whatever file they have selected. So we'll create a variable called read data, which is just going to be the data we're about to read. And then we'll create a variable called this file, which is going to be equal to a file with the location we previously set up plus our file string we just passed through. And this should reference directly one of the text files we've created. And of course, if you're starting this from scratch and you don't have your text files, we will be coding the save button functionality as soon as we're finished with this. Alright, so once we've set up our this file variable, we want to open up that file. So we'll say this file.open, and we're opening this to read it. And then we're going to set our read data equal to this file.readLine. And the reason we're using read line rather than going line by line through each of the text files is because we're only going to be using one line in this example. But if you weren't, you would need to use a loop of some kind to go all the way through the file. Alright, so after we've set up our read data variable and set it, we need to go ahead and close this file. So this file.close. And then finally, we're going to need to return something that will be put into our load data variable here. So what we're going to do is simply return read data. So essentially what this is going to do is go into our data folder, and if we have selected the first index here, it's going to go into the item.text, and it really doesn't matter which text file it goes into because they're all one line and in the same format. So it's going to go through the first line here and grab all of this data. If we want to double check that this is working, after our switch statement up here, we can just add a console write line function. And from here, we can just push in load data. So if I go ahead and run this and I click on, let's say, item and load, you can see we get our T-neon intro and then our size, frame rate, and duration. Alright, so now let's go ahead and add the rest of the functionality to each of these cases. So after case 0 for item, after our load data variable is set up, we're going to want to set up another variable called ItemData, and then one called comp. For our item data, we're going to want to take our load data and we're going to split it. And the thing we're going to split it by is the comma, because we have basically a stringified array right here separated by commas. So we want to convert this into an actual array. All right, and then for our comp, we're just going to set this equal to app.project.activeItem. For the load functionality, I'm not going to add a check to see if the active comp is actually real or selected. We're just going to assume the user has it already selected. And then after this, I'm just going to add a note, which is going to give us a breakdown of how the item works. The first index is going to be the name, then it's going to be the width of the comp, the height of the comp, the frame rate, and the duration. And the reason I have this set up here is because, again, we're converting this string we read from a file into an array based on these commas here. So the 0th index is going to be the name, the next one's going to be the width, height, etc. And we're just putting in a comment for reference. So inside of here, we're directly going to change our composition options. So I'm going to grab our comp.name, comp.width, comp.height, comp.frame duration, and comp.duration. For the comp.name, we're just going to need to grab our ItemData and index 0. And just to make sure, we're going to convert that to a string so we get the right data type. For the width, I'm going to set this equal to parseInt and then ItemData index 1. That's going to convert it from a string into an integer. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the height, except instead of index 1, I'm going to use index 2. Inside of our text file, we actually are going to be referencing the actual frame rate, not the frame duration. But to get the frame duration, we simply need to divide 1 by our frame rate. So I'll say frame duration equals 1 divided by parseInt ItemData index 3. And that's basically going to give us the frame duration, which if it's like 30 FPS, it should be 0.03. For the comp.duration, we're just going to set this equal to parseInt and our ItemData index 4. Alright, all that's left to do now is add the functionality to case 1 and 2, and then we can go on to adding our save functionality. So for our layer, what we're going to want to do is set up two variables very similar to these two. So I'm just going to copy and paste these. Instead of item data, I'm going to go ahead and say layer data for this variable, and instead of comp, I want to say layer. And this is going to be equal to app.project.activeItem, so the active composition. And then we're going to call the selected layers method and grab the 0 with layer selected, so the first layer selected. And again, we're going to assume the user knows that we just want them to select one layer in this case. So then again, I'm going to have a little reference comment here for the values. So name, position, scale, opacity, and rotation. And this is going to be a little bit more complex. So if I go ahead and run this really quick, I'm going to load up the layer information. You can see up here we have our name, our width, which has 3 values, our scale, which has 3, and then the rest just have 1. So we need to make sure we grab the right indices, because when we convert this stringified array back into an array, we're going to need to grab multiple indices just to get like the positions value. So the first thing we'll go ahead and do is change the layer name. Then I'll grab layer, and I'm going to grab the property called position and set the value. And then I'm going to paste this a couple more times and just change the property. So we'll say position, scale, opacity, and rotation. And now we can go ahead and bring in the layer data that we just set up. So for the name, we're just going to set this equal to our layer data index 0, and again we're going to convert that to a string just to make sure it's the right data type for us. And then for the position, scale, opacity, and rotation, we're going to assume these are all just default. So the position is just going to have an X and Y, as well as the scale, it's just going to have an X and Y. If you were adding 3D layers, you would basically, before here, need to check if this layer is 3D, then we need to set the value differently than if it's 2D. So for the position, I'm going to put in some brackets here because we need 2 values. I'm going to start off by parsing int, and we're going to parse layer data 1. And then for the second value, we're going to parse int layer data index 2. And that's going to give us, as you can see, index 1, index 2 is the proper position. Then for the scale, we're going to add brackets again. We're going to start off by parsing our int layer data index 4, and the reason we're skipping index 3 is because that is going to reference the z position for our layer. And for the other scale value, we're going to parse int our layer data and index 5. Alright, and then opacity and rotation are pretty straightforward because they only require one. So we'll say parse int layer data index 7, and again we're skipping 6 here because the 6th index is going to be the third property for the scale. And then finally for the rotation, we're going to parse int our layer data index 8, and that should do it for all of our layer information. And then finally for the loading, we're going to go into our case 2 for our effects, and this is going to be really simple. We'll start off by creating a variable called EffectData, which is going to be our load data, again split back into an array. So we'll say this is equal to our load data split, and comma is going to be our separator here. And then we're going to say var layer is equal to our app.project, the active item, which again we're assuming is a composition. And we're going to go into the selected layers and grab the 0th index. And there's really only one thing we need to add in here, and that's going to be layer.effects.property1, which is going to reference the very first effect on the layer we have selected. And we're going to set the name of that equal to our effect data index 0.toString. And of course you could add more data into the effect.text document, but this is just going to be what we're going to be using for this example. So we've actually finished the functionality for our load button. Let's go ahead and move on to our save button. So down below our load file, I'm going to grab our save button and add an onClick as well. So add that as a function. And what we're going to want to do inside of here is add a switch statement just like previous. So I'm going to add a switch statement, and again we're going to be checking the type dropdown .selection.index. We have case 0 for the item, case 1 for the layer, and case 2 for the effect. So now we're just going to do basically the same thing as previous, except we're only going to be referencing and going into another function. So inside of our case 0, we're going to say check file. And this time we're going to pass through two arguments. The first one is going to be the sort of name, which is item in this case. And the second is a custom function for whether it's the item layer or effect text layer. So because this one's referencing an item, we're going to call a function called ItemData. And then I'm going to go and paste this into our two other cases and change it from item to layer, layer data, and then effect and effect data. So let's go ahead and define our check file function, since that's doing a lot right here. So function check file, and then we have two arguments to pass through. The first of which we'll just call the parameter string, and the second data. So inside of our check file, we're first going to want to see if the file we're looking for exists. I'm going to set up a variable called this file, and I'm going to set this equal to file. And inside of our path string, I'm going to say location plus a slash plus our parameter string plus .txt. So this is going to check inside of our location folder, is there a folder called either item layer or effect.txt, and we want to set this file equal to that. If this file does not exist, so if this file exists with an exclamation mark there, we want to do something, and that's create the file itself. So we'll take this file and we'll open it to write, and then we'll say this file equals a new file, and we want to pass through the same exact thing here. And then this file, we're going to want to write some data inside of it. So we'll say this file.write, and we're going to pass through our data right. And you might notice we don't have our data yet. That's because we haven't defined item data, layer data, or effect data yet. But we'll get there in just a moment. And then finally, we want to close that file. So if it doesn't exist, we want to open up this file, set it as a new file at this location using one of these parameters, and then we want to write some data and then close the file. Else, if the file exists, we want to open this file to write, and then we want to take this file and write our data, and then close this file by saying this file.close. Alright, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, we're basically inside of our save button here. We're first going to check if the user has item, layer, or effect selected. Say they have item selected here. If that's going to be case 0, we're going to go into our check file function with the string called item to know which one we're dealing with here. And then we're going to be setting up our function ItemData now, which is going to go into our actual After Effects project, get the data we would like, and then send it on into the check file function, which first is going to check if the file exists. If it doesn't, we want to make it, and if not, and if it does exist, we just want to write the data to it. Alright, so let's go ahead and set up our last 3 functions here. First one's going to be called ItemData. Next one's going to be called LayerData. And the last one's going to be called EffectData. So to start off, inside of ItemData, the first thing we're going to want to check for is whether or not the user has an active comp selected. So what we'll do is we'll say if app.project.activeItem, if they don't have an active item, if that's equal to null, or if app.project.activeItem is equal to undefined, we want to do something. Let's go ahead and just tell the user to please select a comp first, and then return false to get out of this. If they do have a comp selected, then what we want to do is set up a variable called comp. We'll just set that equal to our app.project.activeItem. Pretty straightforward here. And then all we're going to want to do is return the data we want. Inside of our ItemData, when we call this, we just want to return data. So we're going to say return, and then we're going to be returning an array of data. So the array of data we're going to return is our comp.name, comp.width, comp.height, 1 divided by our comp.frame duration, which should give us the frame rate, and then finally our comp.duration. So anytime we call the ItemData function, it's going to return our comp name, comp width, comp height, comp frame rate, and comp duration, assuming a comp is selected. So essentially, just to recap real quick, whenever we call the check file function here for case 0 for the item, we're going to pass through our item, and then all of this item data, assuming we have it selected. Alright, so now what I want to do is go ahead and copy and paste this comp check and paste it in our 2 other functions here. Inside of our LayerData function, we're going to want to add one more if statement, and this is to check if a layer is selected. So we'll say if app.project.activeItem, and we're going to reference our selected layers. We're going to check the length. If it's not equal to 1, the length of our selected layers, that means they have either 0 layers selected or more than 1. We just want to deal with 1 layer in this case, so we're just going to check for 1. If this is the case, we're going to tell the user to please select only 1 layer, and just like usual, return false to get out of that. Else all of this, if we do actually have a comp selected and we do have 1 layer selected, we're going to set up a variable called layer and set this equal to app.project, our active item, and again reference our selected layers, index 0. And for this, we're going to again just return an array of values. We're going to grab our layer name, our layer, its property position dot value, our layer property scale dot value, our layer and the property opacity dot value, and then finally the rotation value of our layer. So layer dot property rotation dot value. All right, and finally we can set up our effect data. I'm going to copy and paste our layer check in here as well, just to save some time. We're going to want to add one more if statement to our effect data, and that is going to be to check if we have any effects. So we'll say if app.project.activeItem .selected layers, our first layer, .effects.num properties. So this will return the number of properties inside of the effects panel up here. So this will just return a 1. If this is not equal to 1, then we're going to tell the user to please add an effect. And then like usual, return false. Else all of this, if we do have everything set up properly, everything selected and added right, we're going to set up a variable called layer again. I'll just copy and paste this guy here. And then simply we're going to return another array, this time only 2 values, which is going to be our layer, the first effect, and the name of that effect, which in this case would be brightness and contrast. And the second one is going to be layer.effects, the first property, and the number of properties. Now I could have just did the same syntax here, layer.effect1, but I wanted to show you that there's multiple ways to access your effects. Alright, so that's basically all of the code. Let's double check that this is working. So I'm going to delete all of these here and go ahead and run the script. You can see we forgot a parentheses here as well as here. Go ahead and run it again. So now if I go inside of After Effects here, I'm first going to start off by saving my item. So if I go ahead and make sure I have my comp selected, I'll go ahead and click on Item and Save. And now if I go into my data folder, you can see we have our item.txt. It has our name, width, duration, and frame rate. Let's go ahead and do the first layer here. Click on Save. And if I go in here, it's got all of my layer data. And for some reason, this particular case is making me double click on the Save button. So if I double click on Save here, go into effect.txt, you can see we have brightness and contrast and the number of properties inside of it. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this week's After Effects scripting tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed. That's how you can save and load data inside of After Effects, referencing items, layers, and effects. Of course, you could scale this up to do much more, to save effect presets, save animation presets, and much more. So again, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, as well as the bell icon right next to it to be notified of new uploads when they occur. And of course, leave any comments if you have questions. That's going to do it for this week, guys. Next week we have a very exciting new tutorial coming out, and we'll see you then.